Welcome to everyone today. In the high seas, in the low valleys, wherever you may be, across the ocean or just across the street. Hey, thank you for joining us today as we continue our examination of the Bible on Crack Open the Book. So we're glad you're with us truly, and I do pray that this will be helpful as we begin or continue our study of the book of Job. Now, we placed the book of Job, if you remember last time, somewhere pre or parallel to the life of Abraham. Because of the various indicators within the book, that seems to be the best place to put it. This is a period in man's history where there doesn't seem to be any temples. The concept of organized religion, as we know it today, is not a part of the plan just yet. And so the individual heads of these households are primarily responsible for their families and quite possibly for their clans. So we placed it there on the historical timeline as you see there, and we're now going to proceed with some of the details of the content of the book itself. All right then, Job. What do people remember about the book of Job or about the person of Job? It's actually a very large book, but I don't think very many people have actually read it all the way through, and we would really encourage you to do that if you plan on getting the true meaning of this book. But Job is well known as a man of patience. Whether you're an atheist or you're just an average person that doesn't have much interest in religion, or Job's name is known. He's known for patience. The text is out of James chapter 5. It's often quoted, at least in part. Indeed, we count them blessed who endured. You have heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord. And the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. Now, I've chosen a translation that I think identifies what the word means more accurately. It's not just the patience of Job. We did some word defining last time, and we've chose the word perseverance as being more appropriate to what actually Job goes through. So I'll be using that term throughout the course of our discussion or any time that I refer to Job, the perseverance of Job. So we've cracked open the book, and we have invited our classmates to come back. And they had a little break, took a little test while we was gone. By the way, everybody passed the test. A couple of them need to work on their spelling and their penmanship, but they all passed the test. And so we're glad to see Irene back with us, along with William and Marvelous Maryland, and of course, No Works Henry. So we're glad to have you all. Now let's get going. The theology of the book of Job. Theology meaning what? The study of God. Why are we studying God? So we can know what pleases Him. We want to know what His will is and how we're to handle situations down here until the day He comes back to get us. If I don't handle those things correctly, I may incur His wrath, and I don't want that, but I want to please Him more than anything. And so I study Him as He has recorded it in His pages, to figure out what it is that He would like me to do. So, the theology of the book of Job has been studied for centuries, ever since it's been written, I'm sure. And it brings up a very compelling issue, a troubling one in some cases. Many people try to use the book of Job, or the concept here, of suffering in a negative way. That is, they try to show that there's some faultiness in the Christian faith. And they do so by asking a question. If God is so powerful and He is so loving, then why did such a thing happen to Job? In other words, if He's loving, then why didn't He stop it? He must not be all-powerful. And if He's all-powerful, and He didn't stop it, then He must not really care. And that's the situation we find ourselves with many antagonists with regards. But we're not here to do that. We're here to see exactly what the Bible says about this issue. When atheists ask that question, they only really accept the third point of their question. They don't believe in God in the first place, so the first 2 points can't even be satisfied because they've already acknowledged they don't believe in God. They just recognize there is suffering, and they're trying to trip up God. By the way, if in atheism there's suffering, if they recognize suffering, that's an inconsistency in and of itself, because if this world is a product of randomness, then suffering is irrelevant. There isn't any suffering, really. It's just a natural part of the survival of the fittest. So we can't say there's even suffering if we're an atheist. But they even recognize it, but they won't recognize the biblical explanation of why it is. So let's take a look at that. Why does bad things happen to good people? And that's really at the core of what we're talking about. So, as we continue on, we recognize that the fact of suffering undoubtedly constitutes the single greatest challenge in Christianity and its faith, and has been that way in almost every generation. The concern is that suffering in its distribution and degree appears to be entirely random and thus unjust. Now, that's the position that many take. And it has some merit, but there's a couple of flaws in the assumption. Let's first look at the word suffering, what it means. We're looking at Thayer's Greek lexicon. The word suffering, from the Greek word, means trouble, distress, or affliction, but it's tied with the concept of evil. Trouble, distress, or affliction, as it's connected and related to evil. So evil is involved in this process, according to the Greeks. So we want to make that kind of one of our first steps. And so we have our class, and we're going to begin looking at this question or this statement initially and work from there. The distribution and degree of suffering appears to be entirely random and therefore unfair. It appears to be or seems to be random. Maybe it's not random. Maybe there's a real reason for suffering. And we want to investigate that question. Why does suffering happen? That's right, Irene. That's the fundamental question we're asking here. Why does suffering happen? Can we give an answer? Can we explain why suffering happens? Men, women, and children all over the face of the planet suffer. And they ask the question, why? And we should be able to answer that. So let's take a look. In the garden, Adam and Eve, everything's perfect. God said in chapter 1, and he saw that it was what? Very good. So it's great. Now, he gave some further instructions to Adam and Eve, specifically and initially Adam. He said, there's 2 trees in the middle of the garden. You can eat of the fruit of any tree in the garden, any one of them. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you should not eat. For in the day that you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall surely die. Now, if you eat the other tree, you'll live forever. So what we have here is choice. At the beginning and the foundational level of suffering is choice. Man is given choice. We see that exemplified in the conversation between the serpent and Eve. Because the serpent tried to contradict what God said by saying, you will not die. God said, you'll die. The serpent said, you wouldn't die. And Eve had a choice to make. Believe God or believe the serpent, the source of temptation. And we know what she did. She chose to follow the instructions of the serpent. And as a result of that, what happened? Well, it was bad things. That illustrates the power of choice as it relates to suffering. She chose to go directly against God's will and therefore suffered. So there is a connection, it seems, between the concept of suffering and the power of choice. Now let's look at some of the questions related to this. How about if you take away choice? What do humans become? Just take away choice. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to choose because everything is like already pre-programmed. So if you take away choice, what do humans become? Oh, there you go. Henry says machines. You're right, Henry. That's what you become. You take away choice, you become a machine. Machines only do what they're programmed to do, what they're designed to do. They don't make choices. They're machines. Even in the computer world, the choices that a machine makes are already pre-programmed. If this, then that. There's no free will involved. All right? Given that, let's take a look at this one. If we become machines, then what of love, friendship, joy, or peace? What of those character traits? What about them? Very good, Marilyn. Marilyn says they're just not possible. Love is not possible. Friendship is not possible. These are not, if you're a machine, these are not attributes. Machines do not do these things. One of the distinguishing characteristics between a machine and a human being is the power of choice. So, let's follow up with that. Deuteronomy 30, Moses speaking the words that God tells him to speak to the people, reiterates the point we just discussed out of the Garden of Eden. See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, and death and adversity. So it's like he's got it out there on the table. He said, on this side of the table, life and prosperity. On this side of the table, death and adversity, or suffering. Which one would you choose? But remember, you get to choose. If you get death and adversity, it's because you chose it. He's not done. He wants to really drive this point home. So he says, in that I command you today to love the Jehovah your God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments, and his statutes, and his judgments, that you may live a terrible, miserable life. No, that you may live, he says. That you will live. Or, but if your heart turns away, and you will not obey, but you are drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. Choice. Life, death. Prosperity, perish. What do you want to do? It's a choice. Choice is critical to this understanding of the idea of suffering. And if that's not enough, in the book of Romans, the Apostle Paul says the same thing. He will render to each one according to his works, to those who by patient in well-doing seek for the glory and honor and immortality. He will give eternal life. But to those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth and obey unrighteousness, there will be wrath and fury. Eternal life or wrath and fury. This theme from the beginning is driven in the bedrock of man's existence. Choice. Suffering is connected to choice. All right, let's see what our classmates have decided. What then is the reason for suffering? Let me make this clear. What then is a reason for suffering? William says, wrong choices. Wrong choices is a reason for suffering. So we see the power of choice as being connected to the issue of suffering. Is that the only reason? William, don't interrupt Irene. No, did you not read? I know, yeah, okay, Irene, you should be reading. Okay, you should be reading because you know what happens really soon in the story of Job. He gets himself in trouble, and we've already identified what? some characteristics about Job, but let's just take a look. In 1 through 5, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. This man was the greatest of all the people of the East. So in those first 5 verses, we learned some very, very important things about our man named Job. He's a very powerful man. He's obviously known in the land for many, many things, and you've read the text. You kind of pointed those things out. For Job says, "It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did regularly. Did what? He offered sacrifice. Now we've already covered earlier the idea that what? If you sin, the penalty is death. Make a choice and there's a death. But you can get forgiveness if you have what? The shedding of blood. So Job, very in tune to the behavior of his kids, he's not sure, but in case they have sinned, he offers sacrifices on their behalf. So that is going on in the backdrop. So what do we know about Job so far? If you've read the complete portions of the text we just read, you'll know that this man, Job, was blameless and upright. He feared God and he turned away from evil. Remember that connection between suffering and evil? He turned away from evil. Okay? He also would send and consecrate his children, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. As we said, he was sacrificing on behalf of his kids. So does Job understand the principle of choice? Seems pretty clear he does. He fears God and he turns away from evil. Why? Because he wants to live. He wants to have life. We can make that conclusion. How about with regards to his own kids? He's so in tune to this principle. If they're making wrong choices, he, as the patriarch of the family, is making sacrifices on their behalf. Because what? There can be no forgiveness without the shedding of blood. So I think we can firmly say that Job does indeed understand the principle we're investigating, the principle that choice is connected to the idea of suffering. So let's see what the class has to say. If Job was blameless, what was he in the habit of doing? So if he was blameless, what was he in the habit of doing? Making good choices. Very good, Maryland. He's making good choices. Didn't have anything against him. All right, number 2. Why did Job offer burnt offerings for his children? Henry, because he recognized that wrong choices results in suffering. You got it. Not only he recognizes the principle, but he doesn't want his children to suffer, so he's offering sacrifices for them. Because wrong choices, if they're making them, would eventually create suffering. So that's called sin. That's right, Irene. Wrong choices in this context is sin. Thank you, Irene, for pointing that out to us. It's sin, missing the mark, incurring a penalty, forfeiting the prize. We have looked at the definition of that word as well. All right. So having cleared the table of those things and establishing those points, let's take one more step forward. If Job, yes, you have a question. If Job was blameless, why did evil things happen to him? Well, obviously we know that No Works William has read ahead, because Job is going to find himself in quite a predicament on some very serious levels. And if we've identified as the question he's raising here that Job was blameless, then why did these evil things happen to him? That's a very good question. But we first want to drive home the point that what? Suffering can be associated and credited to poor choices, wrong choices, sinful choices. That's one thing that's clear. However, there is the reality. Oh, there's the bell. There's the bell. We'll have to pick this up next time. But there is the reality, class, just hold on. There is the reality that that may not be the only reason for suffering. So next time, we're going to take a look at any other possible reasons, but we want to mark this down for the test, okay? Reason number 1 for suffering: poor choices, wrong choices, sinful choices. Those are clearly indicated in this text. But next time we'll have to deal with, oh, there they go. They're late for the next class. Next time we're going to deal with other reasons for suffering. And so until that time, remember, may God bless you. And remember, pass that blessing along to someone else. See you next time.
This has been a Badger Godbolt production. For more information or to ask a question, please feel free to contact us at crack.open.the.book@gmail.com. You can also visit our YouTube channel, Crack Open the Book, at youtube.com. And don't forget to follow us so you never miss an opportunity to have a conversation about truth.